So who is the better storyteller, the aunt or the bachelor? It's not really much of a question, is it? The bachelor on the train knocked it out of the park. The kids loved his story, and it kept them occupied until they got to their destination. Now, if you didn't read this story, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So let me encourage you to make sure that you always do your reading. Even if you don't get everything, you'll at least have a starting point when we discuss it. I said in our last lesson that there would be examples of irony in this story, so I want to dig into that a little bit. Let's start with verbal irony and specifically understatement. Both the aunt and the children were conversational in a limited, persistent way, reminding one of the attentions of a housefly that refuses to be discouraged. You see some humor there. Most of the aunt's remarks seem to begin with don't, and nearly all of the children's remarks began with why. The bachelor said nothing out loud. This is kind of a good example of understatement. And then he says, "You don't seem to be a success as a storyteller," said the bachelor suddenly from his corner. So these are examples of understatement and verbal irony because the narrator is communicating indirectly how annoying the conversation is. Rather than openly showing annoyance, the bachelor remains quiet, but the wording "he said nothing out loud" indicates to us that the bachelor had plenty to say. And then when he does choose to say something, it's understated. You're not a very good storyteller, are you? Okay, so what is it that's funny about the situation on the train? We have an aunt who seems pleasant enough, but isn't able to really do anything that entertains the children. Cyril, the young boy, is constantly asking questions. The smaller girl is reciting a line from a poem, but just that one line. She's repeating it over and over. That's an example of understatement as well, and we also can identify the point of view in the story from this paragraph. It seemed to the bachelor as though someone had had a bet with her that she could not repeat the line aloud 2,000 times without stopping. Okay, so we can see from the story that we have a third-person omniscient point of view. So basically a narrator who knows everything, a narrator who can show us all the characters and the thoughts and feelings of any of the characters. And then another example of understatement, whoever it was who had made the wager was likely to lose his bet. In other words, that girl's going to keep saying that line over and over and over for however many thousand times the bachelor said he thought she might. And then let's look at one more example of understatement before we go on. When the aunt calls to the children to come to her for a story, they don't exactly leap out of their seats, do they? The narrator says evidently her reputation as a storyteller did not rank high in their estimation. And then the aunt begins her story to try to distract the children into sitting still. And what was her story about? She began an unenterprising and deplorably uninteresting story about a little girl who was good and made friends with everyone on account of her goodness and was finally saved from a mad bull by a number of rescuers who admired her moral character. And does that just kind of reinforce the idea that the aunt is pretty boring? Yes, it does. And of course, the children are not satisfied by the story, and they immediately want to know if the people would have still rescued the girl if she hadn't been so good, which of course they still should. So the aunt's little moral story doesn't really have the effect that she was hoping for. So now let's talk about situational irony. And just to make sure we're on the same page, let's review what these types of irony are. In verbal irony, the intended meaning of a person's words differs from the literal meaning. In situational irony, a story's events violate reasonable expectations. So verbal irony has to do with what's said, and situational has to do with what happens. So what happens after the aunt finishes her rather lame story is that she basically offers a challenge to the bachelor to tell a better story. In itself, that's not situational irony, but the whole setup is. She says, "See if you can do a better job." And then he does. So really, we don't know what to expect. He surprises us by coming up with something that's a hit. By the way, let me just divert for a moment to talk about the bachelor. That's the only way the narrator refers to him. But the only important thing you need to know to visualize the character is that he's a man traveling alone. A bachelor is a man who's not married. And while he could certainly be traveling alone even if he was a married man, I think the author is reinforcing that we wouldn't expect this man, since he's not a father, to be able to control or keep the attention of 3 little kids. So that's kind of overarching situational irony, and then we'll see some more with the bachelor's story. So he launches into his story, and it's surprising at several points. So, an example of situational irony: she was horribly good. First, he describes his protagonist, Bertha, and with that description, horribly good. That's an odd combination of words, as we usually equate something horrible as being bad. The kids get this too, and they find it funny. And then he describes the pigs and the flowers, and the fact that the prince chose the pigs over the flowers, which makes perfect sense to the children. But to anyone else, that would be a surprising decision. He says the gardeners had told the prince that you couldn't have pigs and flowers, so he decided to have pigs and no flowers. And then he gets to the conclusion of his story, which contains significant situational irony. And it's extra funny because the aunt's story was all about a girl being a good girl and all of the many great things that happen to children when they're good. And the bachelor story ends a little differently. As she trembled, the metal for obedience clinked against the metals for good conduct and punctuality. The wolf was just moving away when he heard the sound of the metals clinking and stopped to listen. They clinked again in a bush quite near him. He dashed into the bush, his pale gray eyes gleaming with ferocity and triumph, and dragged Bertha out and devoured her to the last morsel. All that was left of her were her shoes, bits of clothing, and the 3 medals for goodness. And then, just to add a little verbal irony icing to the situational irony cake, one of the children says something surprising. "The story began badly," said the smaller of the small girls, "but it had a beautiful ending." Little girls getting devoured by wolves is usually not considered a great ending, but to the children it was just an entertaining story and so different from anything they were used to hearing. Could we learn a lesson from that? The aunt wanted to make her story moral, to give them moral instruction, but she didn't capture their hearts or their imaginations. She was more concerned with keeping them quiet than with teaching them to love what is good. Because the aunt is more concerned with outward actions than heart transformation, she demonstrates a legalistic approach to maturity. Unlike the aunt, the bachelor cleverly answers the children's questions and holds their attention. I think the lesson here is to remember that there are a lot of people out there who can tell a good story, like the bachelor. But the story they're telling is not a redemptive one, and it can sometimes even be destructive. But if the way that story is presented is more appealing, many people may follow that storyteller and get further away from the truth. That means that we as Christians need to tell the truth in an appealing way rather than an argumentative or boring way. We want to teach others and ourselves to truly love what is good, not just check some boxes or follow a code. God's grace, not mere moralistic teaching, brings about heart transformation for those who believe. Now, Saki, the author of the story, was probably not trying to get all children to pursue wickedness rather than goodness. He was trying to write an amusing story, and maybe even, ironically, trying to teach what I just talked about, the fact that moral instruction that doesn't address heart transformation is likely to backfire, or at the very least be ineffective. As for moral tone, we'd have to say that at least on the surface, this story doesn't have great moral tone. It's not a biblical moral tone like the fairy tale that we read previously. Because it shows the beauty and value of goodness, the magic brocade, that's that fairy tale we just read, aligns with a biblical worldview. The storyteller does not. So I've pretty much answered the big question already, I think. The big question is, why should I want to be good? And we've said that people should do good because they love goodness. Understanding the heart of God and his desire for his children to be righteous in their hearts, which will then spill into their actions, is what leads us to that desire for goodness. Well, you know what else would be good? For you to do some vocabulary. There is a vocabulary handout that goes along with this story. So you're going to work through that. And then next time we'll prepare to read a memoir, which is our first nonfiction selection.